and relations, Middle East diplomacy, the role of soft power, the politics of human rights, NGOs, strategy and conflict management, U.S.-Israel relations, public policy in Israel. He wrote with a number of international organizations such as NATO, UN, University, and others. He is a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, and his articles appear in the Wall Street Journal, the International Herald Tribune, and other publications. His recent publications include Soft Power Play Hardball, Europe's Hidden Hand, Europe funding for political NGOs in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Europe's fallen Middle East policies, and deterrence in stability, Hezbollah's fuse to Iran's bomb. Professor Steinberg, the floor is yours.
I think I've earned the label, the accolade of the absent-minded professor. I thought that I was on this afternoon, and I was listening to every word, but not realizing that I was supposed to be speaking this morning. So, I thought I was off duty until 1:30. I'll get new glasses. This is a very important meeting. In some ways, it's something that should have taken place over the last 10 years. This is not a new phenomenon. The demonization of Israel, the abuse of the universal jurisdiction statutes, and in a broader sense, the abuse of international law, of human rights, of the moral frameworks that were established for the reasons that Professor Zilberschatz has explained, has become not a form of moral correction of political and other deviations. This is not what the authors of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, eventually get the PowerPoint up, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, wait, access to that, this is not good. Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention of 1948 in the wake of the Holocaust. This is not what they intended. That these instruments have become the primary weapons, and I mean that in a almost literal sense, against Israel, the sources of double standards, is a complete moral and political distortion. I think you have to go to my computer and then go, but it doesn't work. Not based on legal aspects. I don't claim to have a legal background, but much more a political and moral issue. The role of moral claims, of the rhetoric of human rights, international law, we hear terms like collective punishment, we hear terms like war crimes, apartheid, racism. That language was adopted when 1,500 non-governmental organizations gathered in, it's on the discount key here. When 1,500 non-governmental organizations, all claiming moral agendas, gathered in Durban, South Africa, under the banner of the United Nations, through the Human Rights Commission at that time, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, some of the major, what are supposed to be moral powers, adopted a resolution, a final declaration, which included, well, we'll get this by the time I finish, which included terms like apartheid, racism, ethnic cleansing. Israel was singled out in that resolution. And this was a plan of action. Again, adopted under the framework, under the banner of human rights, a plan of action. There we go. Thank you. A plan of action, and as the language says, calls for the policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state, precisely using the legal instruments that we're discussing here, using sanctions and boycotts, distorting completely these fundamental values. These are not, I would argue, about justice, about legality, about international law, but very much a continuation of the policies that were adopted by the Arab states in November 29, 1947. The third wave of the attempt to undo the UN Resolution 181 and the establishment of independent Jewish national sovereignty. It has much wider implications, as Professor Zolbashan said, but the main target is Israel. And the process we've seen a number of times. I have to say that I wasn't surprised by the Goldstone. I didn't know that Goldstone would end up being the head of the Goldstone Commission. But certainly the process had been tried many times. It was all based on the Durban process. Israel is attacked, Israel responds, and then the language of international law and the processes, the instruments, from boycotts through universal jurisdiction and UN condemnations, UN reports were brought into place. We saw it in Jenin. We saw it with the separation barrier apartheid wall campaign. There have been Beit Hanun. There have been 5 or 6 similar processes that led us to the Goldstone report. And now we're seeing a similar type of process with the Gaza Free Gaza Flotilla. The NGOs issue the condemnations, make what they call reports, 50, 60, sometimes 150 pages. In Lebanon, I think we're talking about a total of, just Human Rights Watch, total of reports that add up to 100, 600, 700 pages of what I would call pseudo-academic or pseudo-research reports. Those are then picked up by the media, they're headline stories in the media. They then get repeated by diplomats, the United Nations, become the subject of these kinds of discussions in the Human Rights Council, and then our colleagues in academia repeat those same publications, reports, and allegations and claims without any added value, without checking the credibility, and they become then footnotes in learned publications. And the process has been going on for 10 years. I'm going to show you some of the more blatant, more offensive, more immoral examples. And my bottom line is, and I'll say it now so I don't forget about it because I think it's critical, is that we need to recapture, we need to restore is a better term, restore the moral foundations of human rights and international law, of justice. The universality does not at all allow for double standards and singling out of Israel. I picked a few examples to show you how, you all know how absurd it's gotten, but sometimes to see it visually, and usually when I speak to an audience who's not that familiar, these kinds of images are more than surprising, and I think I've heard the term shocking. The one, and these are promoted, I'm primarily focusing on the role of human rights organizations, or humanitarian aid organizations, because they're the ones who have captured the language. They're the ones who are responsible for the distortion. These pictures speak for themselves. War on Once Christmas card with all the theological background to it, and there's many more examples of that. The poster on the other side is by a group of 3 Israeli Arab organizations, one of whom is Mada al-Carmel, very well financed primarily by European governments, under titles like the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, or their program on gender equality. And this is the kind of campaigns which they are running, using this kind of not just the language, but the images, the offensive, aggressive images which are part of that process. Again, under the framework of European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. Just to get to be up to date, yesterday the Methodist Church adopted a program of BDS, boycotts, I think it's a specific boycott divestment program. The report that they used, that they allegedly debated, I used the term allegedly, I wasn't there, but also the debate was not very much of a debate, was based on NGO sources primarily, also some Israeli academic sources. These groups and these types of reports are very predictable, they're repeated, and they are used for this process in a very articulate and clear way. Most of the cases that are being discussed in the next 2 days here, the cases dealing based on universal jurisdiction statutes, largely in Europe, a few in Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Canada. That program was developed in a series of conferences. One was in Madrid, one was in Cairo. The language is very clear. There are dozens of participants from the NGOs which lead this campaign. They're the ones who find the jurisdictions, the magistrates, the individuals who are willing to provide use their courts and their services for these kinds of cases. We magnified in the corner, if you look closely in the corner, you'll see there's a European flag. This was funded by the European Union. Now, they didn't fund this specific title. They funded the Palestinian Center for Human Rights and other groups in order to have what was called a program on dealing with death penalty, and it was primarily, ostensibly, for dealing with the killing of Palestinians by the Palestinians. But this is what it was used for. It was also funded by Oxfam Novib, which is the Netherlands branch of Oxfam. Almost every case that we've looked at has had a primary NGO organization that has provided the funding, the research, in other words, the texts that were given to the judges, and has shepherded the process through. From the case against Ariel Sharon, 2001 in Belgium, all the way through the case against Tzipi Livni. I'm not sure about the most recent case in Brussels that was launched, but I suspect that if we scratch the surface, we'll find that DAA or PCHR or one of the other organizations that has been at each one of these stages behind the process. There's significant money involved. These are not idealistic. They may be idealistic or ideological, but they have the funding to carry on these kinds of programs. This is not something that is done by a couple of highly motivated Palestinians working out of a room in somebody's house and a laptop. These are organizations which have dozens of employees and are able to promote the process in many different phases. Goldstone report is another example of this, and just to show the role of the NGOs in the process. We went through, Goldstone says nobody read his report, and I suspect he's one of the people who hasn't read the report. But if you go through, and my colleagues at NGO Monitor, and I should say that this paper that I'm summarizing was co-authored by Ann Hertzberg, my colleague, our NGO Monitor legal advisor. We counted at least 48 non-governmental organizations that are cited or quoted that form the substance of the Goldstone report. So again, you see the language, violation of international law, violation of IAJLJ, human rights violations, collective punishment. You see it throughout this process. The ones in red are funded by the European governments. The language of the Durban resolution, Durban NGO Forum Declaration, specifically states the way in which this is to go about, and this has been implemented throughout this process. Using the language of international law, the Geneva Convention, immediate convening of high contracting parties, this has been a constant effort. But the purpose of having the UN General Assembly bring a case before the International Court of Justice in 2004 on the separation barrier was not to have an opinion, an advisory opinion by the ICJ, but to take it back to the United Nations as following the methodology of South Africa and have the UN adopt a sanctions resolution, not under Article 7, not through the Security Council, but very much having this process accelerating of isolating Israel completely internationally using the international legal processes and language. As I said, there's a lot of money behind this. And we're talking about tens of millions of dollars specifically directed in these directions. Now, when I have Human Rights Watch's budget of $40 million in Oxfam and Amnesty, I'm not saying all of that money is going into these processes. 5% may be directed at Israel. But when you add it all up, and the targeted money, the money that comes out of the UN in particular, which goes towards these processes, we're talking about at least 5 or 6 times the entire budget of the foreign ministry in dealing with, I still don't know how we say hasbara in English, but in dealing with the response to this.
Hasbara with an American accent.
That's in some ways the best. When you're talking about a fraction of all of those resources, we have some prominent members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry who can be asked the questions of why doesn't the government do more. But if you look at the forces that are arrayed against them, the amount of money, you can see how difficult the process is. Every time you turn around, there's another organization, very often the same people. Michael Sward's name comes up constantly and others, who change the organization. I ran into somebody named Yishai Menuchin at the European Union in the Parliament who was using precisely this kind of language, runs an organization called the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. A few years ago, he was in another organization, I think Yesh Din or Yesh Shvul. The people stay the same, the organizations change, and the amount of money increases from year to year. So this is not a small why in some sort of a minor aspect of the broader political scene, these are core issues, and for many years we've missed them. Where does this come from? And I think this is essential to understand how to deal with it. There is a very broad language, and more than language, a philosophy, an ideology. And I think, as has been said a number of times, London is the main center of this, of what's called post-colonialism. Victims are by definition, or there's a group that are defined as victims. Non-Westerners, certainly Arabs and Muslims, are primary people in that category. It's a patronizing approach. Victims can never be guilty of war crimes. They're not responsible for their actions. It's the West, it's the colonialists, post-colonialists. It's the state actors that are primarily responsible. If you look at the language of many of these organizations, working with a democratic elected government is a crime against humanity. One of the worst things that's been hurled against me is that I work with the Israeli government. I talk to people in the Israeli government. It's a terrible thing. And I'm serious. If you look at an article in which people from B'Tselem were quoted a couple days ago in a hearing that took place in the European Union, that is their charge. They're not elected. They're not accountable to anybody. And that somehow is supposed to make them pure. That is part of the post-colonial ideology. It's anti-state, anti-democratic. It also has a very strong, not just undercurrent, but theme of anti-Americanism. Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, goes back to the Vietnam War and before. And you see this language constantly repeated. This is not a rational process. The people who lead this are not going to be convinced by showing them the inconsistencies, the double standards, the lack of credibility of the allegations, the false claims, the ideology. It's a religion. As Professor Aaron Kotler has called it, it's the religion of the 21st century. And when you have religions and high priests, I better be careful how far I go with this. I think it's very live. But it can very easily be abused, and here I think we have a very clear case of the abuse. So the rule of law is instrumental. I'm not saying that we shouldn't fight this on rational grounds. Somewhere in the middle, the number that sometimes I used to say 70% of the people who are dealing with these issues can be convinced by a rational argument. I'm now down to 50%. It's going down pretty rapidly. But the ability of the organizations and the power to manipulate the language is extremely important here. I'll give you a couple of examples before I get the whistle blown on me and I'm told to sit down. Palestinian Center for Human Rights is a major example of this. Much of their funding, most of it comes from European governments, as well as George Soros, the Open Society Institute, and Christian Aid. They are, as I said, behind many, many of these cases. They were the ones who ran the conference in Cairo, and they were the ones behind the cases in Spain, the UK, and we suspect that probably in some other cases as well that are coming in. This is supposed to be an organization, ostensibly they're funded, for dealing with human rights within the Palestinian population, with the Palestinian Authority. I would guess 90% of their activity is directed against Israel. The head of the organization is also a prominent person in a group called the Federation it's a French organization, the International Federation of Human Rights. They list civilians as civilians, and they're the ones whose statistics on civilians that were killed are used by most international media, quoted very repeatedly in Goldstone and other official UN documents. And they list people like Nizar Ryan, who was a major Hamas commander, as a civilian. This is not an international legal definition. This is a political definition. And it's not just one example, but dozens of examples. They were the ones who coordinated and basically provided the text and the details for the Arab League Gaza mission, which started the process of the opening up of the files at the International Criminal Court, the ongoing process, and the threat of bringing Israelis to the ICC. They issued their report before Goldstone, and Goldstone had to go at least one step better. So PCHR is a very powerful actor in this process. Al-Haq, another Palestinian NGO with large amounts of money. I won't get into the details of the funding. It's murky, but much of it comes from European governments. They were the ones who filed suits in the UK against Israel. In Canada, they work closely with Israeli groups like B'Tselem, Michael Sfard. Shawan Jabarin, the head of Al-Haq, is linked to the PFLP in a number of cases in the Israeli Supreme Court. I think the court issued a statement that at the end, I don't think it was it a ruling or it was a ruling in which they talked about a Jekyll and Hyde. This is the head of a human rights NGO by day and a recruiter and trainer for the PFLP by night. He is considered to be a human rights defender by a large community of these NGOs in the UN framework. There are so many of these connections and so much of the money, I'm not going to spend the time to go through it, that there are more and more examples of this. So we need to find a way of dealing with this. It's an NGO network, it's not even a community, that has been functioning for at least 10 to 15 years in pursuing this agenda. CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, the United States, another example. So it's not only based among Palestinians. And when you add to this Oxfam, War on Want, Amnesty, and dozens of other organizations, you can understand the size of the threat that we're dealing with. I want to spend the last couple of minutes dealing with responses, because presenting a diagnosis, presenting a threat without a response is largely useless. There are four areas which the NGOs that lead this campaign, I think, are fundamentally vulnerable. Most of them are not transparent, neither are their funders. And when European governments provide money for these organizations, without providing any kind of due process information, we have no idea who makes these decisions. We have no idea the basis of these decisions. The European Union, the European Parliament does not hold hearings on these issues, so there's no public information. Transparency is a key issue. Accountability. Governments are accountable, democratic governments. They're checks and balances. They're required by other forces in the system to explain their actions. There's no such thing as in the NGO world. And when the NGO world is more powerful than governments, and there's no accountability and no checks and balances, that's a serious source, not just of failure in terms of due process, but serious ability to manipulate on the basis of ideology, on the basis of personal connections, of revolving doors. The head of one NGO then becomes the responsible for giving out funds to a government, gives it to his friends and his colleagues. After 4 years, he retires, goes back into another NGO, and the revolving door continues. We have some specific examples of that in Canada, because in Canada, unlike the European Union, we have the documents. And we can see how the game has worked, and the Canadian government has cut off at least $11 million worth of funding for these kinds of NGOs on the basis of transparency, accountability, and checks and balances, naming and shaming. The most important issue, I think, is morality. The need to restore, as I said at the beginning, the moral foundations of the processes, of human rights, of international law. The most important, and I think in the long term effective way of dealing with these claims are by challenging the immorality, the abuse of universality, singling out Israel for attacks, not at all discussing so many other areas, so many other conflicts, so many other far more virulent abuses of human rights. Up until last week or 2 weeks ago, no major human rights organizations that claim human rights venues had issued a report, raised the issue of IAJLJ. And I think the only reason that we saw this from human rights in Salem in the last couple of weeks was because we had put so much pressure on them for having, among their funders, among their donors, among some of the officials in these organizations, that they felt an obligation just in order to say, to check off the box perhaps, that we're going to hold them to that. The fact that IAJLJ has been largely ignored, the fact that there's such a distortion in the language of morality, I think is the main weakness and the main area that we need to focus on. Thank you.
And relations, Middle East diplomacy, the role of soft power, the politics of human rights, NGOs, strategy and conflict management, U.S.-Israel relations, public policy in Israel. He wrote with a number of international organizations such as NATO, UN, university, and others. He is a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, and his articles appear in the Wall Street Journal, the International Herald Tribune, and other publications. His recent publications include Soft Power Play hardball, Europe's hidden hand, Europe funding for political NGOs in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Europe's fallen Middle East policies,